Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to this virtual roundtable discussion convened as part of the inaugural Regional Science Policy Business Forum in Asia Pacific that will explore current and future pathways that can mitigate and manage new zoonotic diseases and the impact of ecosystem degradation on human health in the region. My name is Rohit Sehgal, Principal for Global Health at Economist Impact based here in Singapore, and the moderator for this session. I want to thank you all for making time for this discussion today. We have an excellent representation with us today, and I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Colin Butler, Honorary Professor, Australian National University, Dr. Jos Vandeleur, Regional Director for Emergencies, WHO Southeast Asia, Professor Tamina Shireen, Director Institute of Epidemiology, Disease Control and Research in Bangladesh, Dr. Barbara Han, Disease Ecologist, Carey Institute of Ecosystem Studies in the United States, Ada Lomas, Vice President, UNEA, and Permanent Representative of Estonia to UNEP, Edward Moncrief, CEO HSBC Insurance Limited and HSBC Life, and Dr. Yi Wang, Associate Professor and Researcher, Tongji University School of Medicine. Welcome to you all. What makes this discussion so timely and necessary is that COVID-19 and some of its predecessors, such as avian influenza and severe acute respiratory syndromes, SARS as we knew it, have originated in the Asia-Pacific region. Known as zoonotic diseases, which are infectious diseases transmitted between animals and humans, and affect more than 2 billion people and cause over 2 million deaths every year. UNEP's recent flagship report, Making Peace with Nature, reveals that around a quarter of the global burden of disease stems from environment-related risks, including zoonotic diseases. But also climate change and exposure to pollution and toxic chemicals, habitat and biodiversity loss caused by deforestation, as well as increased encroachment of humans into natural habitats, particularly in tropic regions such as Southeast Asia, have been associated with an increase in infectious animal-borne diseases. In addition to their impact on the environment, zoonotic diseases can also disrupt the world economy. According to the World Bank, it's estimated that the COVID-19 pandemic forced the global economy to contract by 4.3% in 2020. That amounts to about $3.6 trillion worth of goods and services, not including the impact of the pandemic through deaths, illness, and loss of livelihood. There is therefore an urgent and apparent need for win-win solutions in terms of biodiversity, agriculture, and health in a region where wildlife exploitation and the derived demand for meat are considered as important drivers of disease. Ambitious and coordinated actions by governments, agencies, businesses, and communities in moving a healthy people, animal, environment development agenda forward can stop future zoonosis from happening and enable us to build back healthy ecosystems while also progressing sustainable development goals. And this is really what we're going to hear about over the next 90 minutes or so. Professor Butler, if I may open up with you first and ask if you could set the scene for us. Is the current pandemic in this regard, in fact, a warning that we're perhaps pushing nature too hard?
Well, thank you for that question, and my thanks also to the organisers of this session and to the government of the Republic of South Korea. Good morning and good afternoon or evening to my online colleagues. So you've asked me to comment on whether we're pushing nature too hard and is the pandemic a warning? Well, nature is not vindictive. It has no mind of its own. So the question should not be taken literally. However, from a human perspective, I think we should definitely treat this pandemic as a profound warning. I'm not sure how many in the audience are familiar with the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment held in Stockholm, Sweden in 1972. Probably more of you will have heard of the conference in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, 2 decades later, often called the Earth Summit. But that first meeting in 1972 was very important in the foundation of the UNEP, the United Nations Environment Programme, which was founded in the same year. Now, the main organiser for that 72 meeting and the Earth Summit was a Canadian businessman and diplomat called Maurice Strong. He was also the founding director of UNEP. Now, his autobiography, which I'm holding up here, Where on Earth Are We Going?, was published in 2001. It starts with a report to the shareholders from an imagined future, 2031. It describes a world of profound disorder, of massive forest fires, including in Siberia, and of famine, drought, floods, refugees, and plagues. Global population has fallen to fewer than 5 billion, but today it is about 8 billion. 2031 is now only 9 years away, and it looks as though Strong's forecast is too pessimistic, which we should be grateful for. But perhaps he would justify any exaggeration by saying he was trying to motivate his readers. There is, of course, a risk from exaggeration. I've been unable to discover if Confucianism or other Asian philosophies discuss crying wolf. In other words, of warning of something so often and so prematurely that the listener becomes jaded and ignores it, even though the warning turns out to be valid. The wolf appears. The story of crying wolf is credited to a Greek slave who lived about 2,500 years ago, but it is likely that Aesop, that slave, collected these fables rather than wrote them. I think it is an ancient story, and I hope that it has universal meaning. Clearly, human civilizations could not have evolved and flourished without their leaders collectively preparing for risk, whether from winter, food shortage, or invasion. The Great Wall of China, for example, shows an understanding of risk by many successive Chinese governments. The manifesto by Bertrand Russell and Albert Einstein, signed in 1955 at the height of the Cold War, also warned that the continued existence of our civilization and perhaps our species is in doubt due to the threat of nuclear weapons. That risk has abated, but it took 30 years and a great deal of effort before it significantly reduced. But just as the risk of nuclear war seemed to be lessening, a book was published called New World, New Mind. Its authors argued that although humans have evolved to understand some risks, such as from a predatory animal or winter, our species has not evolved to easily understand the risks that arise from excessive global climate change, or from global biodiversity loss, or from excessive pollution of other forms. But I think Maurice Strong did understand these risks. Now, bad as it is, the death toll from COVID-19 is small compared to annual human population increase. But the pandemic has had many indirect effects, including a significant increase in global hunger. Strong and others of his generation had personal experience of great hardship wrought by the Great Depression and World War II. I think for people of that time, the risk of another catastrophe seemed more plausible than to many people now alive, who experience, in comparison, great abundance and affluence on a scale once unimaginary. So that affluence is great progress, but it also creates a risk of complacency. When the ocean suddenly retreated around the Andaman Islands in 2004, its indigenous people did not go out to explore the seabed, as some elsewhere did, but instead they interpreted that sign, that ocean retreat, as an urgent warning, in that case of the tsunami. As far as is known, they all survived because they immediately fled to higher ground. In the Indian city of Surat in 1994, simply the rumour of plague was enough to cause a great panic. As many as 100,000 people immediately fled the city. We may be better collectively at responding to risks such as earthquakes and plague than to climate change and biodiversity loss. And I think one of the challenges we have is to see that these risks are actually connected. So in conclusion, we are pushing nature too hard. We are creating unprecedented risk. And if, as now seems hopeful, vaccines and new drugs make COVID-19 manageable, then we should use that breathing space to reinvigorate the global community to prepare and to prevent the many risks from adverse environmental change, which too many complacent populations are currently creating. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. I think that's tremendous food for thought and a great way to open up the context. Indeed, some perspectives for us to consider as we move forward. In some ways, does this in fact tell us that an interoperable and integrated approach to human health and the environment is indeed a critical component of taking our current situation towards a future potential solution. Could I ask Dr. Vanderleer and Prof. Shirin to shed some light on this? And Dr. Vanderleer, maybe start with you first and perhaps talk a bit about the One Health project, the One Health approach, which would be great to hear. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. The zoonotic disease we have, as a global community, been dealing with now since almost 2 years already, has affected over 230 million people and has caused 4.8 million deaths. That's our impressive numbers. But an equally impressive number is that 75% of the emerging infectious diseases are actually zoonotic diseases. That means diseases that are transmittable from an animal to humans. And no doubt what is behind that is that our relationship with nature and animals has substantially changed in recent times. We have seen urbanization, we have seen intensive farming, we have seen increases in population size in humans. And because of all of this, the contacts between humans and animals, and also between humans themselves, those contacts have become much more frequent and much more intense. And with intense contacts is also related the chance for a disease to jump from one individual to another. And of course, when we talk about zoonosis currently, we always think about COVID, and that's correct. But we, as was mentioned already, we also had SARS, we have avian influenza, we have Nipah, but we also had and have HIV and Ebola as examples of diseases that have jumped from animals to humans and then have continued to circulate among humans. So given that we are in a situation where diseases jump from animals to humans, clearly we can no longer just look at human health when we try to control zoonosis. And to do that, we need what we call a One Health approach. A One Health approach is a multi-sectoral approach that brings together people who work in human health, but also people working in animal and plant health and people working in the environment. And maybe I can give you an example of how that actually works in practice or why this is so important. For example, would be, for example, bird flu. If animals are found, chickens, for example, are found to be suffering from bird flu, it is important not just to detect that by veterinarians and report it, but it's also important then to make the link to humans and to human health, and that these veterinarians work with their counterparts in human health to make sure that the alarms are put in place, that the early warning systems are put in place to pick up any case of avian flu in a human. And vice versa, if an avian flu is detected in a human, it is important that then the very veterinarian colleagues are being brought on board to ensure that they further investigate whether this disease, where this disease comes from, and where it may potentially go. So that's just one example of how two sectors, human health and animal health, need to work together in bird flu. But this One Health approach is also important for issues such as food safety, for example, which also require a multi approach and even antimicrobial resistance. We know that the use of antibiotics in animals affects badly microbiotic resistance in humans. And again, this interface between animal health and human health becomes more and more important for zoonosis, but also food safety and AMR, antimicrobial resistance. So when we talk about these interactions or this collaboration or this multi-sectoral approach, what are we talking about? We talk about a number of things that can be done and need to be done. Joint planning, for example, surveillance and detection. I already mentioned it in the example of bird flu. Information sharing, extremely important, that if something happens in one sector, it is shared with other sectors. A coordinated investigation and response when something happens, and also assessments of the zoonotic threats. And then, of course, work on risk reduction in general and also on communication. For example, if we want the sale and the slaughter of live animals in traditional markets, which clearly has been discussed in the COVID context, if we want that to stop, a public health expert in human health is clearly not the right person to make any decision there. That decision comes from somewhere else. If we want to have a more rational use of antibiotics in animals, veterinarians are the key. If we want to detect zoonosis early, we must listen to any signal, not just signals in human health. So, in summary, a One Health approach is certainly much needed if we want to tackle zoonosis, because zoonosis, by definition, is not just a human health problem. And therefore, it is important that we all work together under a One Health umbrella to ensure that we coordinate, that we plan, that we detect, that we respond, and that we communicate together. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. That brings up a great deal of understanding around the integrated approach perspective. Professor Shireen, from the perspective that you would bring to that, would be great to hear from you now.
Uh, Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and I would like to thank the organizer for arranging such a beautiful webinar. So actually, before discussing all the thing, I would like to emphasize on the why the zoonotic disease is transmitted from emerging in the world, because this is due to the degradation of ecosystem service, that is likelihood to for this emerging infectious zoonotic diseases. And on the other hand, the compromised treatment and hygiene increase the disease vulnerability and human to human transmission of the disease. And there are several contributing factors. Already my previous panelists, they all already mentioned this, the for these emerging zoonotic diseases, like the increased human population density, distribution of tropical forest region, mammal species richness, and deforestation. And for this contributing factor is resulting sharing of food as well as living in close proximity, where the chances of spillover is more, which leads to emergence of newly infected diseases at a frequent interval that we are observing for last few decades. And the disease due to climate change is another issue that we need to address, and these are the cross-cutting issues. And I would like to let you know what Bangladesh is doing on this to overcome or to identify the causes of these zoonotic diseases. So, part of in this connection, Bangladesh is doing is taking several initiatives like surveillance at transboundary market to detect unknown pathogens from livestock at transboundary animal value chain, hospital-based syndromic surveillance on acute encephalitis syndrome, influenza-like syndrome, severe acute respiratory syndrome, and fever of unknown origin. And also, we took initiative to find out the human behavioral risk factors, and outbreak investigation of any diseases of zoonotic disease through One Health approach. And we also established climate sensitive surveillance platform like rotavirus surveillance, acute watery diarrhea surveillance, dengue surveillance, and now we are working on development of climate sensitive disease related early warning system. I can tell you one example that the Nipah virus infection, where human became infected through consumption of contaminated raw concept and human to human transmission is also evident in Bangladesh. The first case was identified in Bangladesh in 2001, and since then it is endemic in Bangladesh. And in every year there are several outbreaks of Nipah virus infection in Nepal, and till now we found 135 times spillover regarding this infection. And the reason is the people are living in very close proximity with the bat, and as well as they are sharing the food with the bat. And another example is the COVID-19, where we found that a few people in Wuhan became infected due to this spillover, and then it spread throughout the country, and ultimately it did the pandemic. And I would like to mention the One Health practice that Bangladesh is doing now. Actually, where I work, that is the Institute of Epidemiology, Disease Control and Research. This is a mandated institute for outbreak investigation and as well as the disease surveillance. So in this connection, when we found any outbreak of zoonotic origin, our team, along with the animal team and the anthropologists, we moved together and we try to investigate that outbreak, like Nipah. If there is any outbreak in the Nipah whole, the team from a human sector, animal sector, and the behavioral science and the forestry department, the wildlife, all of the people from those sectors, they move together and try to find out the cause of those outbreaks. And the One Health team approach in Bangladesh is we are practicing this since 2016. There is a One Health there is One Health movement started since 2006, but in 2016 we developed or we established One Health Secretariat, which is situated at IDCL, where I am working. And our One Health movement is very strong. We are now working on the One Health dashboard, where the data from human health will be there, and the data from animal health, from wildlife or forest, everything will be there. And and the people who are working in these sectors, I mean, in these different sectors, they have their own communication between themselves, and the dashboard will be like there is one is the public faced domain, and another is for the people who are working in different sectors. So we used to arrange the meeting in frequent interval, and it's on the process. We are on the process of developing of such a dashboard for the early warnings, for the development of early warning system. I would like to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Shirin. And thank you, Dr. Vandele, for collectively providing such an insightful and an important outlook. Much has been said about how this interaction between humans, our environment, as we've just heard from some of the speakers, may now be tackled through harnessing of data and emerging technologies. What can new innovation standards provide us in this regard? We can't certainly ignore it. Let's hear from Dr. Han and Mr. Edo Lomas. Dr. Han, maybe open with you first and hear about innovation, planet, and people and the collective whole.
Yes, thank you. I think our previous speakers have made it quite clear our current standing and the urgency, as you say, of acting now, using the technologies that we have to bear now to mitigate zoonotic diseases. I think that the Asia Pacific region has been really central to these global issues of environmental change and disease risk. And in many ways, the incredible diversity of this region means that the consequences of environmental disruption are also very diverse and have proven themselves quite hard to predict. And this has the effect of really keeping us on our heels. Globally, we're still mostly reacting to risks as they are realized on the landscape. And so we're left with this major question of how can we better prepare? We can certainly surmise what are the consequences of inaction, but what are the actions that we could be taking now for a healthier future? And here is where I'm very optimistic about what technology and innovation have to offer us. We've been living and innovating for decades in an age of digital information now, and I believe that we're now at a tipping point in this information age that can be harnessed to begin identifying the win-wins between environment and humanity. New applications of machine learning and artificial intelligence are enabling us to make actionable predictions about risks to human health, risks to the environment, and how we might best respond to those risks. To make this point more concrete, I'll just give a couple of examples of recent research that aims to predict where the risk of zoonotic spillover infection is greatest. By applying machine learning, we've been able to train algorithms to recognize the characteristics of species that are likely acting as sources of zoonotic viruses. For instance, predicting undiscovered bat reservoirs of filoviruses like Ebola and Marburg, bat reservoirs of henipaviruses like Hendra virus and Nipah virus, which Professor Sheeran just spoke about, even predicting which insect vectors like ticks and mosquitoes appear particularly well suited to act as vectors that transmit pathogens from wild hosts into humans. And in recent work during the past year, we modeled the 3D structure of the SARS-CoV-2 virus and how strongly it's predicted to bind with animal cell receptors. And we used this model to make predictions about which particular mammal species that have the capacity to become endemic hosts for new viral variants, and therefore contribute to ongoing spillovers of human COVID into the future. These examples just come from one research program. There are many other exciting innovations that harness the power of high-throughput genomics, satellite and drone data collection, ways of collecting data on human mobility and other human behaviors that are absolutely critical for understanding how a pathogen spreads once it has already spilled over. And I think that these technologies have particular utility for better capturing the diversity that we see in the Asia-Pacific region, diversity in its geopolitics, in its socioeconomics, alongside the rich biodiversity that we know for this region. It's very exciting to me personally to imagine what more is possible. Even just bringing existing AI technologies to bear on ecological problems would lead to some major breakthroughs, such as more precise and testable predictions about when, where, and from what species future pathogens may spill over. And beyond this, I think the synergy at the leading edge of technology like artificial intelligence and data access from multiple sectors and disciplines, those synergies really have the potential to change the paradigm toward prevention rather than reaction. For instance, understanding better how to design interventions so that their benefits are maximally inclusive. These innovations, I think, are revolutionizing our data collection and also our analytics capacity so that instead of pivoting constantly from one costly reaction to the next, we can start thinking further upstream to make strategic investments with larger returns on investment for human health and the planet. I'll just conclude by saying that I believe that this forum is evidence of the tremendous potential that we now have to translate a cohesive vision for the future of this region into action and to identify win-wins for all sectors on a healthier planet. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Han. Edo, I think Dr. Han's reflected a lot in terms of the prediction and the value of where harnessing technology can come into the fore and the levels of opportunity that lies there. What would be your perspective for that?
Thank you very much for this opportunity to attend at this very important and super interesting discussion. And similarly to Professor Butler, I'd like to also revisit 1972 First Human Environment Conference, which set up which was the cornerstone for the global environmental governance, and where the principles were the cornerstones for the upcoming years in developing our understanding on how we can and what we should do in deciding the global environmental policy. But I believe that also today's discussion, one of the prerequisites, what we should keep in mind, should be the right for everyone for the clean and healthy environment. And now discussion how we can support the decision making and how we can increase the awareness. Global member states have adopted several years ago the Agenda 2030, and like we know now, we have 9 years to go, but we have a great gap in information on supporting the managing the achievement of the goals. For example, the Sustainable Development Goals and environmental policy related indicators, almost half of the indicators are not accessible. We do not know the status. So now the question is how we are able to manage if we are not able to measure the progress. So therefore, accurate, transparent, and accessible environmental data, which is linked with other pillars, social and economic pillars. The accessible data helps us to identify definitely how to better use our natural resources, and also helps us to design environmental policies. And what is very important to empower to a broader publicity and increasing the awareness to give the accurate picture what is actually happening. For example, I believe the global community is now more than ever aware of the situation of the marine environment and the global plastics pollution, or the awareness through the visualization tools on the forest degradation. These are some of the examples how the data and actionable visualized data through the influence can help us in making better decisions. Global community has decided 2019 to start developing the global environmental data strategy, which should help in harnessing the potential of data, also harmonizing the data strategies and the quality, and also supporting the capacity building. And for that reason, also the government of Estonia has initiated the Alliance for supporting these pillars, calling the Alliance Data for the Environmental Alliance and short-term deal. The deal, which is the framework for capturing all relevant actors. It's policymakers, it's private sector, and it's a scientific community where we can support ourselves in having more wise and evidence-based decision making. And like it has been also mentioned here, that using the newest technologies and building the foresight models will also help us to tackle in avoiding some of the crises or mitigating the crises which we are not able currently to foresee, and very strong links in filling the data gaps for climate and security related data management and avoiding this, for example, the food insecurity, or also being aware of the weather circumstances. So from this perspective, the global community should be activated and understanding that capacity building, which comes through the partnerships, but also setting the global standards that accurate and transparent, accessible information makes our life more evidence-based decision. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Switching gears to probably one of the key drivers that has been come up in what some of the speakers have voiced, whether that's in terms of integration, bringing together the interoperability of various different components to drive better successes, is possibly to get towards initiatives and a coherent strategy into play. And fundamentally, that's about financing. Ultimately, great results come from the realization and commitment, but funding as well. And someone has to pay for this. Well, no better person to provide us some much needed perspective on this than Edward Moncrief. Ed, give us your thoughts and perspectives here. And if one can be more specific, what are the lessons that have been learned, as we've heard from the panelists just now, but more particularly from the COVID-19 pandemic, from a financial stability perspective, and how has the insurance sector reacted? These are conversations that come up in various different corridors. And ultimately, what does this mean for managing pandemic risk for the future?
Thanks, Rohit. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here as a layman, ultimately sharing a panel with such experts. And you're right. I mean, there are massive lessons for the insurance industry and for the financial sector more generally coming out of the past 18 months. Maybe if I list a few, I mean, firstly, I think the way in which we run and measure pandemic risk models has been exposed. I mean, pandemic risk models are not new. In fact, pretty much every insurer and reinsurer in the world has such a model. But I think what we've seen is that these have been historically backwards looking, typically modeled on a 1 in 100 year historical event, such as the Spanish flu 100 years ago, and not sufficiently forward looking. So they failed to account for the multiplier effects of globalization, modern transport, aviation, freedom of movement, etc. So I don't think anyone's models anticipated the spread and the speed at which the pandemic spread. And I think insurers have had to learn the hard way when it comes to zoonotic diseases, that this is not a risk that can be constrained to a particular set of national borders. And so it can't be managed by a particular credit rating or a particular balance sheet in one country. So I think we're going to see a lot more forward-looking stress testing, internationalization of risk models going forward. I think, secondly, what we've learned is that pandemics are inherently unequal in their impact. I mean, for a global pandemic, the insurable consequences have been extremely unequal. As insurers, we're data-led organizations, we're long-term organizations. What we're really interested in is the long-term deviations from the mean or from the trend line. So it's excess mortality, it's excess morbidity, excess hospitalizations that's important. And this is where we see the impacts of the pandemic have been most pronounced from a life insurance and a health insurance perspective in particular. Places like Hong Kong, where I am, but Australia, New Zealand, actually excess deaths, excess hospitalizations have been negative over the past 18 months. The health of the nation has never been higher. In the US and the UK, however, excess deaths have been 20-25% above pre-pandemic mortality levels, the highest they've ever been. So I think this is going to factor into how we price risk locally in the future. And no longer will we just default to saying emerging markets will pay a risk premium versus mature markets by virtue of having historically lower life expectancy and lesser healthcare systems. In fact, what we'll see now is a counterbalancing where we're starting to account for the prevalence of comorbidities and lifestyle-related health and risks that have a higher correlation with pandemic impact and insurable risk. And that's quite an interesting revolution, I think, for us as an industry. I think the pandemic, as a number of the speakers have already highlighted, for us, the pandemic's highlighted that biodiversity needs to be given much more attention as a subject in its own right, rather than being, what I think is typically seen as a footnote as part of an organization's wider ESG agenda today. So, I mean, insurers globally hold $36 trillion of global assets, and huge progress being made now in terms of how we drive net zero decarbonization within our investment portfolios. I don't think until last year, the industry was really thinking proactively or systematically about the role it can play as a steward on biodiversity risk, particularly in Asia, and how do we measure and monitor the impact, and how do we set targets to manage the impact of biodiversity loss across investment and underwriting portfolios. And this will change now, and it is changing very, very fast. And I think finally, probably the biggest lesson that we all learned from the past 18 months was the way in which governments unilaterally stepped in very quickly to act as effectively stop-loss insurers or insurers of last resort, with fiscal incentives, with furlough schemes, subsidy schemes, tax holidays, etc., to mitigate the immediate short-term financial impacts of COVID-19. And when we combine that with the coordinated action taken by central banks on interest rates, this has created second-order impacts on financial markets that are much, much, much bigger than the impacts that the first-order risk of the pandemic created for us. And I think we're only starting to see now the long-term implications of these actions, whether it's on asset values, whether it's on inequality, whether it's on moral hazard, zombie companies, etc. And my gut feel is history is probably going to look back on some of these decisions a lot more negatively than we have done so far. So clearly, insurers, the financial sector more generally, we've got to be more proactive rather than reactive when we look at this risk. We've got to figure out how the risk can be spread more broadly across the sector, across global balance sheets, and across capital markets. But also, as Dr. Han said, how do we move from being a reimbursement player and being a reaction to risk? And how do we use our collective powers to focus on prevention and proaction? And how do we prevent the risk and the impact of pandemics in future? And pleasingly, there's lots of very exciting things happening there. And I do start to see now globally correlated actions happening between industries, governments, regulators to nudge us forward in that direction.
Thanks, Ed. There's a common theme that's coming through, and you mentioned words such as from reactive to proactive. It's also been coming up in terms of the inequality or perhaps inequity in terms of how the pandemic has also had its spread over. But what we've heard in the last 30, 40 minutes or so is starting to become a clearer perspective around some of the key pillars, some of the key sort of cornerstones of what's really quite necessary as we talk about this particular topic, whether that's financing, whether that's data and technology, the innovations, the value of integration, and where we're headed in our relationship with the planet. But the overarching question is really about what we've learned from this experience and how, or if, we'll be able to find prevention pathways for future pandemics. Fundamentally, at the end of the day, what have we learned and what will we learn from this that will take us forward? Dr. Wang, talk to us about the prevention on future pandemics in your perspective.
Thanks for inviting me. I'm very glad to be here. And so today I would like to talk a bit more about what we have done with the Shanghai CDC to manage the COVID-19 in the past few months. Actually, so it's not the CDC that has done a lot of work, but all the elements of the China's healthcare system has been fighting against these pandemics. But today I'll talk from the CDC perspective, since we've been working with the CDC, and that doesn't mean the other departments are not as important, but just from my perspective, I'll talk some about the CDC. So we've done a lot of the epidemiological investigations to support the scientific analysis and try to provide evidence-based judgment. Until September, the Shanghai CDC has completed approximately more than 30,000 close contacts, and among which the 1,200 cases were confirmed. And so in this process, just like the other speakers have mentioned just now, the information technology and big data have provided great aids in these epidemiological investigations. So please let me show you two little codes. They're here. Can you see that? So this one is called the health code. So the green if you have a green code, that means you are healthy, and if that turns yellow, means you have been contacted with a confirmed case, and if that's red, that means it's a confirmed case. And another code is called the traveling code, like this. That will show where you've been traveling in the past 14 days. And just similar to the healthy code, a green one means you've only been to low-risk areas, and yellow ones means you've been to medium-risk areas, and red ones means you've been in high-risk areas. So this technology really help a lot with epidemiological investigations and to provide accurate information in a very short period of time and save a lot of labor forces. And not only that, they also help a lot with the disease management, because a lot of the public transportations like subways and buses and public areas like shopping malls or amusement parks would require green codes only for people to access these areas, and in that way to reduce the possibility of infections within these areas again. And another part of the work we've been doing a lot is nucleic acid testing. So Shanghai CDC has completed around 90,000 emergent sample tests and around 300,000 environmental sample tests until September. So for efficiency, all the tests were completed within the same day that the sample was collected. And so apart from that, another important part of the work we've been doing is the promotion for vaccination. Until the end of August, around 70% of the residents have been vaccinated. And for the main districts in Shanghai, that rate has exceeded 80%. And the residents who are not yet vaccinated are encouraged, even with monetary incentives right now, to get the required shots as soon as possible. Because as we all know that the vaccination is a very effective way to prevent another wave of the outbreaks of that disease. So actually, as I just said, all the elements of the healthcare systems play important parts in the fighting and management of the COVID-19. And so we are all thinking about these prices we have paid to fight against this disease, so the huge price, and what we can do to avoid that in the future, and what we have learned from the past experiences and from the lot of efforts we have been put in fighting this disease. And from my perspective, so the first, from my perspective, the first take-home message is actually just the same as Professor Butler has just told us, that so these diseases, these pandemics happen. It is actually a warning sign that we are actually pushing the nature too hard. So although the origins of COVID-19 is not yet clear, just as well as SARS and other infectious disease, but these zoonoses are probably warning signs that tell us we are probably be too arrogant, and we have done something that we should not be doing, or we have entered somewhere we should not be putting our human activities in. So I think the take-home message from these efforts and the lessons should be that we should show more respect to the boundary, not only the boundary between individuals or the boundary between communities or countries, but the most important, the boundary between the human activities and the nature. And secondly, from my perspective, I think the importance of the infrastructure of our healthcare system should be completed, should be improved to prevent future pandemics. So the primary, secondary, and tertiary preventive strategies would require a self-contained healthcare system. So that includes CDCs, community healthcare centers, hospitals, and other elements. So only in this way we can quickly respond to epidemics like the COVID-19 and before they develop into pandemics. So in future, building up the self-contained healthcare system and to improve the current healthcare system is important. But not only that, as other speakers have mentioned, it's not only the human health is important, but also the health from other aspects, the health of animals, the health of the other elements of the nature are important. So I think I'll stop here and thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Wang. That was hugely informative. We have a couple of interventions that we'll move to now. Could I ask Kathy Yutong Lee, a youth major group? And we
Thank you
also
very much,
have.
moderator.
Yeah, go on. I'm so sorry.
No, you go first.
No, please. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, moderator. For the floor, I'm Kathy, speaking on behalf of the CYMG, the Children and Youth Major Group of UNEP, and I also follow the UNFCCC process from a gender and youth perspective, also serve as a One Step Greener ambassador of the COP26. And first, many thanks to the Secretariat for facilitating and organizing. Also thanks to all the panelists for the very insightful conversation. And as the CYMG, we have a few points we wish to highlight and a few questions to our panelists. So first and foremost, we would like to reiterate the critical importance of including youth and of course, consulting with youth and children from policy to implementation, from an international level all the way to regional, national, subnational, and local level. And of course, to highlight youth engagement in all levels of their work. And of course, we welcome all the panelists to share if they have any examples of meaningful youth engagement in their work. And in addition, we'd like to encourage furthering global and regional partnerships and also to enhance support towards LDCs and most vulnerable groups and countries. And as mentioned by various panelists, that zoonotic diseases link very closely with various environmental issues, and we would like to encourage furthering joint work between UN agencies as well, for example, WHO, UNEP, and of course the two very important conventions, UNFCCC and the CBD, and more. And of course, also to engage with their youth constituencies in the joint work. For example, the CYMG of UNEP and Yango, the youth constituency of the UNFCCC. And also, of course, given the youth constituency of the CBD. And I guess thirdly, also an interesting question, because I also work by profession, I work in private finance. So I have a question to add specifically, is how do you see, of course, employees across HSBC and across financial services, not only the ones who work in ESG teams, engage in the topic of health of the planet, of people, and also environmental issues. And also, we would also like to encourage more youth involvement in the work of HSBC, including capacity building events and training programs, mentorship, and also strongly encourage the private actors like HSBC to set up youth advisory councils to integrate youth consideration in your decision-making processes. And last but not the least, encourage everyone and also their organizations and universities to include, and also, of course, UNEP to furthering inclusivity of civil society stakeholders, namely youth, women, and indigenous peoples. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kathy. Your questions around the inclusivity of youth constituents and the value that the youth constituents' voice brings to this critical area is clearly an important one. You posed a direct question to Ed, so perhaps I can ask Ed to maybe kick off a reaction or a response to that, and then would be great to hear from the other panelists on the more broader issues on how diverse inclusion can also help further the agenda.
Thanks. Well, look, thank you. Well, look, a great question, and clearly we take youth extremely importantly. Ultimately, the customer, they are the customers of tomorrow, the shareholders of tomorrow. and increasingly today, if we look at how our products and services and communications are evolving, right? And I think it's certainly where I'm sat in Hong Kong. HSBC has a wide plethora of youth partnerships, sponsorship partnerships, trustee and educational funds with universities, etc., and schools, and we do across the region. Is there more we could do? For sure, and I think the idea of kind of youth advisory councils is a great suggestion, and happy to take that forward. I think the kind of specific question around employees and their involvement in ESG is a very good one, right? And what I see certainly in my business and increasingly across the peers that we have around the market is ESG has gone from being a relatively niche silo team of passionate individuals acting in parallel to the major workings of the firm to being utterly intrinsic and embedded into the organizations of the company. And that's top down and bottom up, right? So firstly, at a board level, this is a boardroom agenda, and directors are holding management to account on the delivery of their ESG objectives. And then secondly, from a bottom up level, we have employee resource groups, what we call ERGs. And these are bottom-up, sponsored by particular business leaders, but these are bottom-up staff affiliations, employee affiliations that are driving sustainability, driving D&I, driving inclusivity, driving ESG initiatives and collaborations across the globe. And I think that these didn't exist 3 or 4 years ago. We now have several in Hong Kong and across the region. So I do think that the role of the employee resource groups as a way to drive bottom-up progress across the organisation is great, and it's very, very important for us to involve youth more often in that. My earlier comment, why it's important for financial organisations to get this right, and to Rohit's opening comment around someone's got to pay for this, someone's got to pay for decarbonisation, someone's got to pay for biodiversity protection. And if we just allow governments to pay, then by definition it will be the youth that pay for the national debt in the future. So financial organisations have a role to play to minimise that and prevent that from happening.
Any comments from perhaps Dr. Vandelay? You referred to the One Health approach, and perhaps there the value and the diversity and youth inclusion may have value.
Yes, thank you very much. And indeed, diversity in the One Health approach is key. As was mentioned by Professor Shirin, One Health approach is not a new approach. It's not something that was invented for COVID. It's around for many, many more years. And when the agencies behind it are WHO, are OIE, are FAO, and also UNEP. And so by bringing these agencies around animal health, around food and agriculture, around health, around environment together under one umbrella, I think that is already an example of diversity. More recently, an expert group has been formed to advise these agencies on the ways forward, on the strategic way forward, on what are the gaps in the knowledge and so on. And also a guide exists by these 3 agencies or by these 4 agencies around zoonosis and how preventing zoonosis. So that in terms of diversity, of course, working with youth in addressing zoonosis is of course important. They have their role, but probably at local levels they can play a very, very important role. For example, at community levels, around collecting information or passing on messages could be, for example, examples, raising of awareness, raising around issues of hygiene, around issues of AMR and so on. So I think there's a lot of role that also the youth can play, but also I think multi-sectorial work requires also a change in thinking and change of mindset. We tend to think in silos, and if we want to work in a multi-sectorial approach, for example, among the agencies that I mentioned and that are behind the One Health approach, clearly all of us need to change the way we're doing, and no longer thinking just about our own narrow field of expertise, but do that in a much more cooperative and environment, a cooperative approach, with an open mind. And so there also, I think all the colleagues involved in this One Health approach will certainly also need to take into account the role that youth can play.
Thank you. In the interest of time, maybe we can move to the second statement that's coming to us from Anna Mileto-Wilk, Major Groups and Stakeholders. Anna?
Hi, I'm Anna Celestial. Thank you for allowing me to intervene on behalf of the Asia Pacific Regional TSO Engagement Mechanism. We feel that the voice of TSOs and peoples on the ground in policy forming venues like this need to be given more value. The COVID-19 pandemic could have been avoided if we treated nature differently. However, intensive resource extraction from large-scale mining and logging that destroy the natural species barriers to zoonosis remain unabated, with some countries ramping these up in the name of COVID-19 economic recovery. Agriculture that converts wide swaths of forest land into plantations and intensively farms livestock, despite risks of zoonosis, is still here. Poverty drives many into the exploitation, trade, and sale of wildlife. When zoonotic diseases emerge, systemic inequalities render the poor and marginalized even more vulnerable, even more so for women, farmers, and fisherfolk, indigenous peoples, and persons with disability. Poor living conditions make social distancing and adequate sanitation difficult, while poverty makes sufficient nutrition impossible. Global inequalities render millions of people unable to access and receive life-saving medicine and vaccines. We believe that to mitigate zoonotic disease, rapid ecosystem degradation has to stop. Intensive and unsustainable resource extraction that also displaces our communities has to end. The frontline protectors of ecosystems, our environmental defenders, have to be protected instead of attacked. Unsustainable production patterns of industrial and agricultural overproduction in the name of super profits have to change. At the same time, we need to increase the capacity of peoples to face emerging diseases by ensuring that basic health rights are met, regardless of gender, location, age, economic status, or disability. The TRIPS waiver on vaccines has to be implemented. The privatization and commodification of healthcare should be reversed. Proactive care for people's health and environment should be prioritized over reactive solutions. Most importantly, we need to recognize and overcome the systemic barriers that prevent us from attaining a healthy planet and healthy people. Intrinsically, this means for us placing the people and the planet over profit. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that. And I think there's a feedback back, Professor Butler, to I think your opening context, that finding the even balance between what is an avoidance of natural degradation versus where we're headed in terms of our own human progress and how we can sort of find a way through that. Would you have any perspectives or anything to echo from what Anna just said?
Well, thank you, and I really appreciate her call for us to pay more attention to inequality and the poor. Look, I prepared a short, just 2 or 3 minutes to answer the question, ambitious actions that pave the way, and I'd like to read that. Some of it you'll see is relevant. So I started off mentioning Maurice Strong, the first Director General or first Director of UNEP. And he was also influenced by this book, The Limits to Growth, which was published in 1972. Strong argued that the task for humanity was rational global management of the finite resources of the earth on behalf of all people, and that clearly includes the poor. And we need to establish international cooperation, not just slogans of globalisation, which I believe rely too much on market forces. I think the UN system needs to more clearly acknowledge that resources are limited instead of thinking that economic growth is endless. And I think that's a big problem with the Sustainable Development Goals as they're currently framed. They kind of posit that economic growth is endless. I think the UN should champion redistribution, especially hope and opportunity, as I believe Dag Hammarskjöld, the UN Secretary General, whose plane was mysteriously crashed. Some people say it was shot down in 1961. So he championed this redistribution, and I think we need to rediscover some of the idealism of the time without being naive. We clearly need to recognise and respond to climate change as a genuine emergency, and I'm not criticising other governments, but my own government, Australia, only today announced yet another coal mine in Australia. So how can we think that they're taking this seriously? We need more integration of the wisdom and understanding of the UN Population Division, which I think has a great deal to offer as to how we can not only respond to refugees and hunger, but prevent them. Prevent so many refugees and reduce hunger. We need, very importantly, as several speakers have said today, to develop a far less exploitative attitude to nature. Nature has to become a partner rather than a resource that we just endlessly degrade. We need greater respect for other animal species, remembering humans are also animals, and there's more and more evidence that other animals have considerable consciousness and emotion. I think that's an under-recognised aspect of One Health. We need more appreciation of the health risks of diets that are high in meat, and we need to better treat and prevent parasitic diseases, which, for example, can lead to people being iron deficient and have trouble learning. And so those people might benefit from eating more meat in their diet, but they might also benefit considerably from treatment of their parasitic illnesses. But finally, although echoing a little bit about what I said about Maurice Strong, the people who were children in 1945 when the UN was founded, they're very old today, and even their children are retiring. And I think the loss of people whose lives were personally transformed by the experience of those crises that gave birth to the UN has created some vulnerability, not among the panelists and probably not among many of the listeners, but more broadly in the community. There is, I think, considerable we're sort of sleepwalking towards these thresholds, and COVID-19 is definitely a wake-up call, but they need to hear it. I think obviously we need technology and we need artificial intelligence, but we can't. That's necessary, but not sufficient. Same with market forces. Some of the listeners will have heard of the slogan "Health for All" by the year 2000, which was promoted in the 1970s. It now might seem ridiculously naive, but when it was promoted, which was included by Hafton Mahler, who was then Director General of WHO, he called the 1970s the warm decade for social justice. And I do think we have to return to a combination of idealism and also great courage and determination. So we need idealism, but we need to recognise the reality of limits and to build social mechanisms to attain our targets. Thanks very much, and thanks to all the other speakers too.
Thank you, Professor Butler, and thank you, Anna, for not just the question, but allowing us the segue into what Professor Butler has so eloquently framed, and that is really about the ambitious actions that pave the way alongside this session on the open floor that we're now talking about. And if I may treat, Professor Butler, what you said as a segue to Dr. Vandelay. We talked, I think, as Professor Butler has said, is that the value of what we now build for the future and recognizing all those nuances, how do we then ensure that critical approaches like One Health don't just end up becoming, if one can say, a slogan, but actually something that represents some of the values that Professor Butler has represented, but what this panel as a whole has also put across? How does the One Health approach truly build and grow from here?
Yeah, thank you. And I fully agree with the professor's comments. And the challenge indeed is to turn these thoughts into something practical that actually makes a difference. I already mentioned a number of areas where the One Health approach can play a role, and it starts with planning. It starts with having a strategic vision around where do we want to go and build around that. I think that would be the first step. But then, of course, also we shouldn't forget around implementation that when we talk about detection, when we talk about response, etc., that we all work together and keep in mind that we are part of nature indeed, and that we are an animal indeed, and that therefore it's important that we not only look at ourselves as humans, but that we also take into account the other side, to call it that way, the animal side, the nature side, the environmental side, because it's all interacting. And the consortium, to call it like that, of the agencies that I mentioned that are behind the One Health approach, represent these different facets in one way or another. So I think we're well positioned to start off on this, but yes, there's still a long way to go.
Thank you for that. And it's interesting because as we talk about what are almost ancient concepts, health, animals, humans, the cohabitations of how ecosystems are now coming together. Yet we're in an age of such advanced technology, and we heard from Edo and Dr. Han just how and where technology and harnessing predictive value, but at the same time important frameworks. Perhaps that's a question for both Dr. Han and Edo, that why is it that we haven't been able to harness till date the power of big data at the scale that perhaps we require more now than ever? Dr. Han, perhaps we can start with you.
Yes, thank you. I think that one of the major reasons why we have not taken advantage is because the data themselves are not actually accessible. I think the major barrier to any kind of scientific innovation or search for a solution in the future really rests fundamentally on our situational awareness. We say that everything's interacting, and we say that financial markets can't sustain the current trajectory. We say these things because we know them intuitively to be true. But in order for us to come up with solutions that are actionable, we actually need to understand a bit better how things are interacting so that we can intervene in a way that's efficacious. So I think that some of the near-term actions that we must take include making data more accessible so that we can get better mileage out of the data that we already have collected. And those effective uses of the data that we have in hand will therefore uncover additional outstanding knowledge gaps that we can then coordinate together to fill. So I think that without good situational intelligence and information and data sharing, it's really difficult or impossible to quantify disease risk, let alone make good decisions about how to mitigate that risk.
So that, Edo, your perspectives.
Thank you very much. And I can also add to Professor Hans that I believe one shortage what we have is interoperability. We have data, but starting from the national level, we are keeping the data in the silos, and the economic related, environment related, and health related data. These platforms are currently not interacting, and the data is not communicating and giving us useful information for our decisions. So I believe there we have definitely opportunities to move bigger steps. The other thing is also the engagement of people. It's not only scientists or the governments providing information, but also engaging more with people through citizen science, because the tools are there, but we are not using the information for the benefit for over us. And what is very much important, and also reacting a bit to the youth engagement, that definitely the COVID-19 gave us the warning. The global planet had a holiday from the human activities, but we need to now focus on building back better and using the new technologies, information platforms in creating the clean technologies, green technologies, and like previous speakers have said, putting more focus on nature-based solutions, where all it comes together and creating jobs, giving them more economic wealth and cleaner environment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It all seems to boil back down into how do we build back better? How do we learn yet, face the resilience with resilience that we need to? And it comes to that question, Ed, if I may ask, around the resilience of finance and how finance and the preparedness that we've learned so far has actually will draw us into the future. What would be your thoughts on that?
Yeah, thanks. I think, I read somewhere recently that the world needs roughly $1 trillion of investments per year for the foreseeable future in order to transition just to a lower carbon economy, not a zero carbon economy, a lower carbon economy. So look, clearly that isn't going to happen without the financial sector facilitating it, without the banks structuring these investments and these facilitations, and without the insurers and the pension funds buying into them, and how the financial sector manages the capital allocation to a build back better world, I think is critical. And pleasingly, there is a lot happening now, and COVID has been a catalyst to the previous speaker's comments, to this being managed on an international sort of borderless basis, because these are borderless risks that need to be dealt with through a borderless financial system. Net zero is obviously the main talking point and the fastest progress so far. I think HSBC, we've committed to being net zero in our own operations and supply chain by 2030, and we've committed to making over $750 billion in sustainable financing and investments over the next decade. And I think for the financial sector, this is actually the key. It's less about looking at our own operations and more about how we use our scale and our levers to transition customers, buyers, sellers, markets globally into a better, greener, more sustainable future. The task force on climate-related financial disclosures that was set up by the Financial Stability Board is of massive importance. I genuinely think in a decade's time, investors will look at forward-looking climate disclosures in a company's reports in the same way that we look at directors' remuneration disclosures now. It's just going to be a totally normal, expected part of how investors appraise the governance and the risks of a company. And when we look at it from a sustainable insurance perspective, there are three categories of these climate-related financial disclosures. There's physical risks, which I think are pretty well known, not perfected, but ultimately, catastrophe risk is something that the industry's been doing for a long time. There's transition risks, which is almost a new subject for us, but critical in Asia when we look at emerging markets that have very large agricultural and manufacturing sectors. And there's litigation risks, which would seem more remote, but we've already seen a pension fund in Australia sued by one of its members after failing to provide him with the right level of information about how it manages risks of climate change. So this is real stuff. And the financial sector, by virtue of having deep pockets, will always face this litigation exposure. And I think my final point would be risk brings return, risk brings opportunity. That's how financial markets work. So there are opportunities that this subject brings for insurers, in particular, to drive and stimulate more demand for green bonds, long-term green bonds issued by local governments, for stimulating more investment into environmental activities, to structure insurance-linked securities that spread catastrophe risk across capital markets and lower the cost of risk for companies and for buyers. And I think for organizations who get this right, they will benefit from long-term value gains. I think it is noticeable when I look at the incredible work that UNEP PSI is doing, when UNEP PRI are doing, when what the Financial Stability Board is doing. This is still very European-led, to be frank, or Western-led. So there is an opportunity for Asia, for Asian insurers and Asian financial players to step up and be better represented in formulating these structures and these strategies. And I do see this as a great opportunity, and more Asian players are going to be doing this going forward.
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot. As we can see, time just flies by when we talk about topics like this. These are not anything that can be sorted and solved in an hour. But when we look back in the last hour that this discussion has been had, we've covered a tremendous amount of ground. We can hopefully now begin to recognize the tremendous priorities that zoonotic diseases can force onto our everyday lives, as we've just been hearing, and reach all the way up into global economies, not now, but even in for the future. The necessary skills and actions that somehow can be taken today to help set the framework for our very future. Going around this virtual table as in terms of the final sort of ambitious actions that can help pave the way, and I know some of the speakers have already reflected some of that. But let me give the 2 minutes for each person if they want to reflect on what we've heard today, what some of your key messages and action messages might be, and in an overall sense, to give your perspective. And I know, Prof. Butler, you've given us a perspective, but if you would want to give a summary of what your actions or outcomes from that are in the minute, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, I've run out of notes, but I'll just summarise some things. I mean, I think the main thing is we need to recognise that this we're on one planet. You know, we're not going to terraform Mars in our lifetime. I have great admiration for these people who make the private rockets and go to space, but I think much more effort should be made to protect our own incredible planet and our own other species. And I briefly mentioned population without going into detail. That we need to slow human population growth by giving people much better opportunity. I saw something yesterday which was about fertility rates in Uganda, and the women that had 7 or 8 children, they hadn't gone to school. So we need to give great, like the SDGs say, you know, if we can do them, then we may have a less unequal planet. We mightn't have people going to Mars on their own rocket, but we'll have a planet here that we can survive, and our children will survive, and that should be the dream. And thanks so much to UNEP for this opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you, Robert. Dr. Van der Lee, a minute summary, 2 minutes actually.
Yes, thank you very much. I think the first thought that I wanted to share is that COVID has been a wake-up call, and we are not out of the woods yet. When you look at the global data, yes, the numbers are going down across the world. There are still some countries that don't follow that trend, but by and large, the numbers are going down currently. But this disease is very likely to be here to stay in one shape or another. And in the future, we may see again, time and again, some upticks of this disease, depending on what the protection levels are in the people and the specifics of certain variants. But so we're not out of the woods yet. But maybe more importantly is this can repeat itself again. And so are we using this wake-up call to be better prepared? Are we using this to put systems in place so that if this happens again, that we pick it up quicker, that we are better prepared, that we react in a more equitable way, etc. So that is certainly one thing that we should take home as a take-home message. The second thing is the underlying stuff here, and I think many panel members talked about this. Our relationship with nature. We cannot keep on doing what we have been doing for the last call it decades or longer, and maybe from a personal point of view, I think we each have to play a role here. We each have to think through around what is our footprint when it comes to living on this planet, in terms of what are we doing for our own health, but what are we doing for the planet's health? And it starts often with ourselves. Can we reduce at a personal level, purely personal level, the energy we're using by switching off lights that we don't use, by eating food that is more healthy and there for ourselves, but also for the planet, etc. And so starting with ourselves is certainly something that we can all do. Even with or even without bigger agencies taking action, that will also have to happen. But also, we all have to play our own role. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Vanderlyn. Professor Shirin, would you have a few words to say on the ambitious actions as you see taking us ahead?
Thank you, thank you. I would like to echo with other panelists. Like we have to think about the activities in under One Health umbrella, because we don't. If we just think about our human health, it will not work, because every human health always depends on other factors like the environment and the animal health and the wildlife, everything. So we have to keep the wildlife or we have to give the space for the living of the wildlife, so that we can keep ourselves safe from them. And not only the zoonotic disease, we have also think about the AMR, the antimicrobial resistance, which is another threat for us. Then if we take message from this current pandemic, that is the COVID pandemic, we have to prepare ourselves for the another pandemic, because if we look back, there are several small outbreak, but those are the outbreak, and still there are some outbreaks like Ebola, like MERS coronavirus outbreak, in SARS corona, H1N1 pandemic 09. These are all diseases of zoonotic origin. So we have to look back, and we have to think about it. We have to take the decision, and we have to make ourselves prepared to face the future pandemic. And in this regard, we have to think about the One Health movement, and we have to move with other stakeholders like the animal health, human health, environment, and the forestry department, wildlife, etc. So the major challenge here is to get the information or the data from several stakeholders. That is the most, I think this is the only challenge in the world, not in different countries in the world, regarding the sharing of data. So in that case, we have to be rational for this data sharing, and because not to prevent the zoonotic disease, but not to prevent or to identify the outbreak, we have to think about the early warning system. And for this early warning system, we have to have those data together. So I think in those areas, we have to work more for the future. Thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you, Professor Shirin. Dr. Han, your perspective.
Yes, I would like to echo what my colleagues here have said. I think that an ambitious next step to pave the way towards a healthier planet, it also sounds incredibly simple. It's just communicating. I think when we are dealing with something that's so complex, that diseases emerge from a complex system that is interconnected with everything. You know, Professor Shirin just mentioned antimicrobial resistance, and earlier we talked about the toxic effects of pollution. I mean, the stakeholders and also the disciplines that are involved, and the people who stand to benefit and to lose from the multiple ways these complex systems can play out is staggering. And so in order for us to take actual steps in a direction, marching forward in the same direction as a global society, we need to do the hard work of figuring out how to align our information and how to communicate in a way that that we materialize, right? We can't just wait for the communication to happen organically. We don't have time. We have to put programs in place, put actions in place, and engage folks now in an active way, because the consequences of inaction is just us not being prepared for the next one, and there's just no reason. With this COVID-19 thing still going on, there's just no reason for us to be underprepared in the same way, without access to information, without access to the crucial amounts of data that are still even siloed within our own governments, within our own countries. Like others have mentioned, I think that the bridges that we must build across disciplines and across countries must be actively built right now with investment, active investment from all of the stakeholders, because the consequences are just, they're too big to ignore.
Thank you so much, Dr. Han. Ado, your perspectives on our ambitious actions?
Thank you very much. I will start from the stating that as we are sharing one planet, we should also act as a one team. But what COVID-19 pandemic clearly showed, that developing countries had a very disproportionate impact. So we need to work as one team in supporting each other in capacity building, but also in supporting the policy development. So I would have a call for actions as upcoming UN Environment Assembly next year is giving the opportunity to strengthen actions for nature. So therefore, the active participation from all groups of the society is very crucial. Also, what we need to do is to strengthen international environmental governance and supporting member states in implementing already existing commitments which have been put in place over 50 years. And also to harness the potential of big data and supporting decision making, supporting the capacity building through the strong partnerships from science, policy, business, and civil society. And of course, joining with a deal which helps all this to do. So thank you very much for this opportunity to participate, and congratulations to the UNEP team in their inauguration of the UN Science Policy Business Forum Asia Pacific Forum today.
Thank you for that. Dr. Wang, your perspectives on the ambitious actions for paving the way?
Yeah, I think I have already mentioned some in the previous talk. The take-home message for today is that I think we just remember to learn lessons from this past pandemics. And someone said that the only lesson humans will learn is that they never learn. But I don't think that we should let that happen. Otherwise, we will end up nowhere. So. Yeah, that's my take-home message for today, I think. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wang. And Ed, from your perspectives?
Thanks. I mean, I'll echo what others have said. Right, we've got to be more forward-looking in the way that we measure and we proactively anticipate risk, pandemic risk in particular. We've got to work on an international and collaborative basis, and that includes sharing data. And insurers as very large repositories of data have a very critical role to enabling that and allowing risk data and catastrophe data to be remitted across borders. And I guess kind of my final comment would be, I think we need to really reappraise what the purpose of capital is and what the role of an organization is. I think it was the Chicago economist Milton Friedman in 1970 who said the social responsibility of business is to increase its profits. You're not going to find any business leader that says that anymore. COVID has been a massive wake-up call, and organizations now, I think, are pretty clear in talking the talk that the role is to optimize value for the full range of stakeholders. And per our earlier conversation, that includes employees, it certainly includes youth, it includes governments, it includes the communities in which we serve, and it includes the planet and the natural resources that we consume and absorb. So we're all talking the talk. Now we've got to walk the walk. TFCD and net zero are two major global initiatives, and the financial sector needs to get behind it and drive it as fast as possible and with as much vigor and attention as it can do.
Thanks for that. We've come to our scheduled close. I want to give a big thanks to our speakers today. Thank you so much for the contributions and the information and education, really, for the topic. The organizers, the government of South Korea, and the people behind the scenes who ensure we continue to have such important and vital forums, and of course, all the people watching. Thank you so much, and goodbye.